Here we go. Oh yeah, and I forgot to say Al is the co-teacher. And
Nice
they
to
are
meet you.
in Bend. Yeah. And also a graduate of PSU. Yeah, so Edlyn, you're a graduate, or Katrina, one of you is. Yeah, cool. Yeah. Um, Alrighty. So welcome, everybody. I just wanted to introduce Upswell, a team at Upswell that's going to be talking about their museum kiosks. Upswell is an experience design studio in Portland, and they help forward-thinking leaders advance their vision through experiences, environments, and platforms. So, and their URL is upswell.studio. So yeah, take it away.
Hi. I'll introduce all of us here at Upswell. Thanks for letting us join you. We're happy to talk to you today about some of the interactive kiosks / tables that we've worked on and some of the considerations that have gone into many years of working in those forums. My name is Erica Dillon. I'm a partner, founding partner at Upswell and also creative director. And I brought members of my design team as well to be able to answer questions from their personal perspectives as well. So with us today is our art director and senior designer, Erica Hassinger. I can wave Erica. That's Erica.
The other Erica.
That's right. I have with us Edlyn Wang, and she is, you were in the PSU program, right?
Yeah, like 4 years ago.
Yeah. She's a designer, she's been up Upswell a year, and she all a lot about, coming out of a program and coming into our studio and working in some interactive media that was not as familiar. Particularly kiosks and tables. And then I also have with us Associate Creative Director Katrina Petrovich Byas. And she was also a PSU grad and studied film and political science, if I'm correct. And Katrina works on these interactive pieces really from a content and experience design perspective. So while Erica Hassinger and Edlyn are working on user interfaces and user experience, UX, and visual design, graphic elements, Katrina is coming at them from a content and just sort of a larger experience design perspective, a service design perspective, depending on what it is the kiosk is. So we all work very closely together to kind of, from our different disciplinary perspectives, to realize some of the projects that we've been asked to work on with some of our clients. Just a little bit about Upswell. So we work primarily in the cultural sector. So many of our clients are folks who are looking to engage the public, not through marketing means, but through sort of sharing their either expertise or their collections or their mission, the work that they're doing. And because of that, we're asked to, there's certain kinds of work that we do that is really specific to those kinds of institutions and the goals and problems that they have, that they're hoping that these interactive media will bring audiences to them. So that's a little bit of context for some of the things that we're going to show you. What we're not going to see is a lot of marketing oriented pieces. We really don't do marketing work at all. We also don't do a lot of product design. So we're not creating like digital products in the sense that you might say download, an application or go into a retail store. These are really interactive kiosks and tables that you would encounter if you went to a museum, if you went to a library, but a library that's doing an exhibition, not like a library collection system. Or if you went to sort of like a research institution and they wanted to introduce you to their programs and services. So those are the kinds of things that we do. So what I thought I would do today is just I'm going to show you just like, an example kind of 3 types of interactive experiences that we've created, and some considerations around each of those types, like things that we think about and things that we have learned over the years. And after I show you some of those examples, we can just really open it up to Q&A. There's more examples on our website, of course. So we can always, if there are other things that we want to look at, we can turn to look at some specific things there, but I thought I'd keep it pretty brief so you guys have more of an opportunity to ask us questions really that you think are most relevant and interesting to you. So without further ado, let me share my screen. And so this, I know y'all are working in Figma, so I decided to present from Figma as well. We also use Figma in the studio. So I've just pulled in some examples here. I'm just going to walk you through a couple of those. Okay. Let me do something, which is to make it so it's visible. Fit to screen. Okay. So the first kind of category of interactive kiosks and tables, and kiosk is kind of a generic form. Table is specific in some ways just because of the orientation of it. A kiosk is, we might call a kiosk something that is of a smaller form factor, just from a nomenclature perspective, smaller form factor that's maybe angled, right? Where these larger screens that are horizontal, that look more like a table, we typically call them a table. And there are certain kinds of considerations depending on your form factor that are going to be really important for you to take into account. So that's one of the things that I'll talk a little bit about. But you'll hear me, kind of talking about tables and kiosks sort of a little bit separately because they have certain different kinds of considerations with regards to them. So exploring and discover, this is one of the key sorts of types of interactive kiosks or tables that you might encounter in a cultural institution. We've done many of these. Typically, what the work that these are doing is allowing the institution, let's just say it's a library here at the Library of Congress. We'll just use this as an example. An institution who wants to be able to present a lot of content in a small footprint. So this example is of a table called The Faces of Suffrage. And we were approached for this exhibition to be able to convey the kind of work that was being done on a state-by-state basis throughout, like from, 1840 until, 1920, during the period where suffrage, where women and men were fighting for women to have the right to vote in the United States of America. And they wanted to be able to show some of the important figures that were from each state, even actually like US territories as well. So that's a lot of content. If you've got like several people that you want to highlight and there's like 54 places you need to highlight. So oftentimes institutions are looking for ways to present a whole bunch of content that they couldn't like put on a wall in an exhibition or something. And so a digital format like this makes that possible. The challenge with those kinds of experiences is they can turn to what we call a content dumpster. So it just becomes a way for people to say like, well, here's a bunch of random stuff we don't know what to do with. Let's just stick it all in this thing and make it work. So we're always trying to find still a hook or a reason this thing to exist, right? So that it doesn't just feel like extra stuff, right? Too long or no one knew what to do with it, so we just kind of stuck it in here. So these they present an opportunity, so for visitors to do like a deeper dive as well. And one of the other challenges that they present really from an interface perspective, I'm sure my team can jump in here at any point in time, is they can feel very like, you want to try and make it such a frictionless experience as much as possible, right? Because when you're navigating a lot of content, it can be really boring sometimes, right? So again, this goes hand in hand with the whole content dumpster problem that you're faced with, which is how do I make this interesting and not just like next.
We call it a queue and view.
That's it, queue and view, exactly, right? So, and there's nothing wrong with that. Depending on what the experience is, that may be perfectly what's called for, right? You might have a little photo viewer that is, you should just be able to like click through things, and it just gives people a sense of what that content is. But for these larger pieces, you'll notice a couple of things. The first thing is that this is a question to deal with form factor. And again, coming back to the difference between like kiosks and interactive tables. Tables, if it's open on all sides, we're often presented with the need to design for multi-sided access. So you'll see here that it's oriented the opposite, right, on one side, right? So we've got two, what we call placemats. They're places essentially where we're saying, you should stand here and do something, right? And so they're mirrored images of each other. So, we're creating a table where at any one point in time, half of it is being used by one person, half the other. You'll see some other examples of tables where there's multiple like of these placemats, not just, well, actually, maybe there are only two. Two is usually a pretty good number for these like 55-inch or 65-inch screens. So that's one of the key considerations is where is it in space? If it's a free form or freestanding experience, then oftentimes you're really got to figure out how are people coming up to it? Where are we going to ask them to stand? If it's if you are putting a table or a kiosk up against the wall, you've obviously changed, the orientation and sort of how you're asking people to engage with that content. So, up against a wall, you're saying, maybe two people side by side, maybe it's a one-person experience, but, you're not able to access something. So that tells you how you're going to consider your sort of user interface. But the freestanding tables are always have particular challenges with regards to how you're going to make it make sense when it's kind of in the round, as it were. People can walk around it. So this is a common example. Just a couple things to point out about this. If you can see my cursor, hopefully. In order to solve the challenge of a lot of material, like we had probably almost 300, I think, portraits of people in this exhibition, and we also had a map, and we also had ephemera, other related materials associated with each state in the United States. So that was a lot. So we created this little navigational tool here that you can see on the right, where you could switch between these different modes, and then you use this dial, as it were, and it just allowed you to very quickly scan through or skim through, just like on a little wheel, all of that content, so that we weren't asking people to do this, hit next for a long time, or like search for 50 different states and try and pick one necessarily. You could do that. You're able to pick a state too. But it was just, again, an affordance to allow people to get through a lot of material in a really short period of time. And I like this particular kind of UI solve for something where there's a lot of content. That's not going to be the case with all of the kiosks that you might encounter, but for these kinds of explore and discover ones, that's going to be one of the main challenges, is how do we get people through the content in a way that's really
particularly for this one,
okay,
because they're organized by states and people have a tendency to want to look for their state. So it wasn't just a bunch of random images to kind of browse through, but if you're coming in from, Idaho, you might want to find all the Idaho portraits, right? And so that's a really great, quick way for you to fast forward to the stuff you're interested in.
Exactly. Keep you on track here if anyone's. Oh, great. Thank you, Alana. Make sure I'm not missing chats. So this is an example of the sort of explore and discover type of interactive kiosk or table that you might encounter out in the wild. The next example are the types of kiosks or tables that that are focused on either creating or playing. So these are much more, they can be much more free form. The one that I'm showing you has kind of elements of free formness and structure to it as well. But they're really asking people, and you may see these, you'll probably see more of these in spaces that are maybe more marketing oriented spaces. I know Adobe does a lot of these where it's really about exploring a kind of medium, for instance, and kind of digital affordances for doing things like drawing or coloring or making things. Some of the key considerations when it comes to these kinds of things is just like really there can be a lot of really cool UX that goes into these if you keep it really simple, right? So I think the challenge with these is how do you make it feel very, again, frictionless and not like a huge library of like menu things that you need to do. Like you're not trying to recreate Photoshop, for instance. You're trying to create something for an average visitor, as it were, that they can quickly get into something, mess around a bit and get immediate feedback and get some immediate delight, and then walk away and have had a pretty good 30-second experience if that's what they want to do. Or if they want to really like dig into it, all the things that they might want to do are there. The example that I'm showing you here is for a poster maker that we developed with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights for their traveling Nelson Mandela exhibition. And this was about anti-apartheid posters. And so the idea was that we would create a kind of really like, imagine if you were preparing for a protest and you went to your community center and they had people making posters and you had supplies, you had markers, you had poster board, and you had maybe images and you had tape and glue. The idea was really drawn from that sort of like real world and using this, these basically creating a canvas where it was just a bunch of assets laid out and a poster board essentially. And the idea was that people can resize, spin around, enlarge, change the color on both the assets themselves and on the posters. And they could, when they got a design that they liked, then they would publish that poster. Oh, great, my internet connection is unstable, so tell me if I'm breaking up. They would publish that poster and then it would appear in one of these little some of these were paper and some of them were projections. So you could create a poster and it would appear on the here as a projection. So one of the opportunities here was really, again, to create sort of a way for people to manipulate materials on their own and get a little bit deeper into sort of like the experience of what someone else may have thought about when they were, creating a poster that they would take to a protest, for instance. But also with the iconography that was part of the anti-apartheid movement. So it's also a way for people to understand more about the content of the exhibition by actually putting their hands on it in particular ways. The thing that was challenging again about these is trying to not have it be a very UI heavy experience. You can see a little bit here. Can I zoom into this? Let me see here. This is only the problem with presenting actual size.
Do you want me to send you a link to the Vimeo video for this too, or?
Yeah, you can. If you want, you can throw it into chat. That'd be great.
Yeah.
But you can see here, there's, we have like a little plus button. We have a little palette on the side. There's a little maybe done button. We tried to keep it really seamless. And what we did was try to use, code to create an opportunity for people to just, drag these assets around, enlarge them. By tapping them once, you would change the color. You just kept tapping through, it would just change. So using these kinds of little tricks where you don't need a menu necessarily to do something. You kind of build using the digital affordances that we all know and love, right? Like pinch and zoom, build those into the way that you could manipulate these materials, and then add in some delightful things like if I grabbed this asset and pulled it off, put it on my canvas, but left half off the side, in code, we made it so it would just like disappear that half. So it would automatically, help you create a really beautiful poster without necessarily having to do like, now I need the scissor tool or something to cut this edge off. We did it all automatically for people. We call it automatically, right? But essentially, finding ways where you can, again, reduce the friction to someone getting to a result as quickly as possible, so that they can spend more time sort of just playing really and enjoying. I'll go back to this view. So this is a really great genre to work in, and it has lots of challenges because once you get into things like letting people draw, in our world, free form anything, and this is, I think, probably one of the most important things to note about create and play. When anything is free form, people will inevitably, like take it to its limits. So, you name it, they'll create it. So one of the things we do is, how do you put guardrails, right? So people aren't just, creating dirty pictures or writing dirty words that then, the public sees at large. Institutions care about that, funnily enough. So we put guardrails on them. We provide the assets. These are the only assets you can use. It's not free form. You can change the color. You can make it big. You can make it small. I mean, obviously people can still do, potentially, we really think about like what are all the weird things people could do with assets, and try to put guardrails on them. So that's, once you get into drawing apps, it gets really tricky. Because as soon as you let people draw free form, you have to have moderation oftentimes that's associated with that if you want them to have that experience. So something to think about when you go kind of into that route of create and play, is what are the guardrails you're going to put on that experience for visitors and the public. Okay. Here's another example. This is the drawing app, right? So this ended up being moderated. You got a little picture, right? Like it allowed people to like see bits of their collection, but then kind of play with them and manipulate them. And then it would auto save it and then would project it onto this screen on the sides of these little drawing studio kiosks. So it was very simple. It had some basic things, right? But it was timed, and that was a guardrail. So they could only do it for so long, and then it would change to another thing and it would put whatever you had drawn up on the wall. So it allowed, again, people to make it feel like it was fresh. You didn't get stuck. You didn't have to choose what you wanted to do. It kind of chose for you. So these people have a lot of like decision paralysis when it comes to engaging in some of these things. They're like, I don't know what to touch, or I've never seen this. What is it? So we often think about ways to serve things up to people so that they can just start reacting to them, and engaging in them, and then, making it so they have an easy way out too, easy off ramp as well. So that's why in this particular case, we ended up using time as one of our guardrails and changing things out quickly, and then actually building in moderation. So all of these images would get saved to a folder, and someone from the museum would look at them to make sure there wasn't anything that they didn't want kids to see, and they would delete them, and then they wouldn't appear in the public portion of that of the display, essentially. Okay. And then the third category I wanted to talk a little bit about, and this one is probably quite unique, is learn and practice. So there are some tables and kiosks that we create that are really about, have an educational purpose, and they really end up having to conform to a kind of program, like an educational program. And because of that, they're doing really specific things. And the challenge with these is to come up with kinds of takedowns of activities that people would do in real life. The example that I'm showing here is for, it's a 2-hour lead experience at the Cohen Center for Interactive Learning in Portland, Maine. And it's called Lab Venture. And essentially, we've got 10 of these digital tables, and they have educators who help 11-year-olds who visit from all over the state go through this 2-hour lead program. And the table asks them to do things that a scientist would do, who is studying habitat in the Gulf of Maine, particularly habitat around lobsters and black sea bass. They're learning how to read data and work with data and make the connection between doing analyses of certain kinds of animals and data, right, and what their outputs are. So this took a really long time to develop because it has to be based on real world science. And so we had scientists reviewing these, but we're also trying to do things that are they kind of mimic, like I said, something in the real world, but they're done in a very slimmed down fashion. So for this, so for here on the right, you can see there's this exercise called the sorting exercise. And this is introducing people to the way that how different species are caught in nets and how they are discarded, what kinds of things they are. So this is called bycatch sorting. So it was an interactive where you would have to put the different kind of thing, and it was timed. Is it a lobster? You put in the lobster circle. It's just a circle. And if it's something else, garbage or another kind of sea creature, you put it in the bycatch bucket. And because it's timed, they try not to make mistakes and do it. And it's so it's a very simplified version of something that happens in real life. And using these simple things like a circle as opposed to a skeuomorphic or sort of realistic, like pot or something, because you're just trying, there's very specific sort of learning goals associated with it. And so we're trying to not recreate the real thing, but trying to get at the learning goal, right? So whatever is the simplest way of doing that. Clean, simple interfaces often help an audience focus on what it is that we want them to focus on. So this is an example of, like I said, a more unique kind of experience where there's a lot of design considerations because there's so much either content considerations or sort of learning outcome considerations that you have to design for. These are few and far between. There's not a lot of big programs where people are doing things like this. They happen kind of in really specific places, say like a research institute, or maybe it is a museum that has like a learning lab, and a learning lab, would have, some very specific pieces that would maybe like digital pieces that would be made that typically school groups are coming to, and the school group comes and then they have an opportunity to go through these programs. So very specific pieces that you don't encounter very often. So those are examples of the three kinds of categories that we as an experience design firm are often dealing with when we are creating or being asked to create interactive kiosks and tables. So again, right, like learn and practice, create and play, and then explore and discover. And explore and discover we get probably the most of, I think. People have a lot of content, they want to present it somehow. Okay, that's my presentation. So I just wanted to give you a sample of work that we've done, show you some examples, talk a little bit about some of the considerations for each, but then really open it up to you all and have you ask us questions either about these specific things or really just anything at all relating to interactive design of these kinds of experiences. My team is happy to answer questions about their own experience as well. So if you're like, well, what is it, how did the PSU, how did that take you into, another space? We're happy to answer those questions as well. So I turn the floor over to you. I will, but I'll keep my share up just in case we want to look at something specific here. So.
Okay. Thank you so much. We have a whole lot of questions, so I've been busily organizing them over here. But I guess maybe to start out with, how did you get your first kiosk project? How did you get into it in the first place?
I'll speak from my experience just because I started Upswell. So I started the company. When I worked at a place that doesn't exist really anymore. That's called Second Story Interactive Studios. And it was a unique design studio in its day, which was like 1999, I think was when it was founded. And I think like they sold in 14 or something like that. And it's went through some iterations since then, but they were in the early 2000s. And they had realized that there was a craving for this kind of content experience that was not just on a website. This is the days of Flash, right? Where they had suddenly a lot more design that was going into, say, websites, right? And they were much more experiential. Think Nat Geo, right? Nat Geo was like doing all this kind of stuff, right? And those were some of the early clients. And we realized that there was an opportunity not just to have these in a web space, but to actually take it into a gallery space. So that market had kind of been opened up. So when I went to work there, that's when I was first exposed to it. Now, fast forward, I start my own company. The first kiosk, that's really hard because honestly, we're doing many times as many websites as we are kiosks because people are still presenting a lot of their content online. It would have to be probably through like an organization like the Oregon Historical Society, right? Where they have, it's really people who are presenting experiences to public. And they're oftentimes at like historical societies or museums. And the thing that often helps when kind of getting into these is having some understanding of the hardware. So on our team, we have software developers, but we also have folks who understand the hardware. And so that's really important for these pieces to be able to know what you can do given what the hardware is. So hardware often makes many decisions for you. If you have a small screen that's going to drive a certain experience versus a large screen, it's going to drive another kind of experience. So, and sometimes those decisions are being made by exhibit designers. So anytime you get to exhibit design space, you're going to be confronted with digital stuff that's in a space. And that's when you need to pull out your bag of tricks and like figure out, okay, like what is it that they're wanting this thing to do, and what space are we given, and what's the hardware going to be given that. So it's pretty much when we started getting to an exhibits.
Can I jump in there too?
Please.
I think one of the things that's come about more recently is that a lot of organizations and institutions want to tell similar stories or present similar content to what they have on the website, but they want to do it in a way that's controlled, right? When you're on the web, people can put in any search term they want. They can go to any other browser. They can, bounce around on the site and find different things. And so a lot of times, I think kiosks particularly come about when an organization wants to tell a more focused story, but still use a lot of the same techniques, strategies, language that's going to be coherent to people, right? Everyone knows, how to pinch and zoom on their phone. Everyone knows a forward and back button, right? Things like that. So they want to use those strategies that everyone knows, reuse a lot of the same content, but do it in a way where they can control the setting a little bit more to guide people's sort of learning outcomes or their experience with a particular story or particular piece of content.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah, that kind of brings me to another question, which is, do you work with exhibit designers? Do you build the kiosks? Like, where does the physical part start at your, like, where's that line? Do you design the physical kiosks and then someone fabricates it? What does that look like?
Katrina, you're welcome to jump in if you'd like.
I think it really runs the gamut. I think it really depends on the structure of the project. For museums, a lot of larger museums like the Library of Congress have very strict guidelines around what you can build, right? Because they're in a historic space. And so for projects like that, a lot of times, the size of the kiosk or the place in the exhibit where the kiosk is, or even sometimes the kind of technology that can be used, is a pretty circumscribed sort of set of guidelines that you kind of have to follow. And there's flexibility in that for sure. And we try and have the relationship, we can make recommendations, right? actually, I think in this Library of Congress example, they had initially thought about putting this up on a wall and have people walk up to it. And we said, no, I think given this content, a table format actually makes more sense, and we could kind of make that work. But for us, other times we completely get to define the experience for kiosks, right? We get to say, given the exhibit sort of storytelling goals or accessibility goals, which we can talk more about, we really think that this kiosk needs to be this size, oriented in this way, and use these particular pieces of technology. So I think for us, it really depends on kind of what specific role we're playing in a project, whether we're sort of thinking about the experience design holistically from an exhibit design standpoint, like we're sort of playing exhibit designers, or whether we're brought in, as we sometimes are, as sort of like interactive media specialists, and we're there to really be kind of consultants around realizing a portion of a larger idea.
And some of it's driven by the desired user experience too, and how prominent of a role the interactive plays within the context of the exhibit itself. For sort of larger experiences, for example, we've done work for the Oregon Historical Society where they wanted to kind of do a send-off moment where folks could create their own memory quilt or memory blanket and collect some various artifacts from the exhibit digitally and make a sort of a takeaway piece that they could create at the end. So it was a larger kind of capstone moment as you exit the exhibit. So for that, we used a larger display, and it was on a wall with a prominent frame. So you have that visual cue that's a bigger moment, as opposed to like maybe a smaller kind of more intimate experience where if you do a questionnaire or something, might be an activity, for example, where it's like off in a corner away from the crowd and it's smaller and it's something you're meant to do on your own. So just the size and the form factor that it sits in tells you a lot about what you as a user might expect from the experience. If it's a big, juicy, fun activity, or if it's a smaller thing that you might want to do on your own.
I lost you, Alana.
Oh, did you hear me okay?
Yeah, my dog was barking, so I forgot I muted myself. Oh, now she's barking again. Okay, so our class is an introduction to UX, UI, and motion design, kind of like intro to all the things. And so we're thinking about right now user stories and personas and user testing and accessibility. So I have a bunch of questions around that, but I will start with so if you're considering accessibility, especially for these museums that a lot of them have ADA requirements. So you've got that. How do you test for that?
Now Katrina.
Sure. I will say,
Sorry,
so
Katrina.
I will say this, what you'll find is that, in this space, in these sort of interactives, ADA really doesn't cover it. ADA is really about wheelchair access and reach. But beyond that, there are guidelines that you can look to. I think there's some, in terms of testing it, that's kind of one stream of work that we can talk about. And I mean, in terms of accessible, we can talk about accessible affordances too. Like we could even look at this screen that's on display now and talk about the various ways that we tried to make it kind of more accessible. I think testing it is really about kind of reaching out to folks who have sort of, different ability and having folks be able to give feedback on it. I think also thinking about, parity of experience for folks, like from in the concept phase of your kiosk, right? Like is this an experience that is like purely visual, right? That, for example, like the Library of Congress portraits, there's no sound in that kiosk, right? In that table. And so if you are a visually impaired person, just by virtue of sort of how that piece came together, there's not a lot of other affordances for you to have that same experience. So I think thinking across modality and ability in terms of like, what are various senses that we could employ here? Could there be an audio component, right? do we support multiple gestures? There are kind of many things that you can do to kind of get at different levels of affordances for folks.
Mm-hmm.
We have tested some of our experiences, and I think part about the testing is that you need to build it in, and you need to have relationships with people.
Mm-hmm.
If you're testing for certain kinds of affordances, like if you want folks who are have a person with a visual impairment, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
you might want to have a relationship, and we built some of those relationships so that we can ask specific people to test our experiences, particularly if they were looking for really specific outcomes for that community. You can also do things like you can use screen readers like JAWS and things like that to and be able to run some of these programs through it. It's easier, obviously, for websites than it is for kiosks. So it's a really good question, and I think the first is understanding the guidelines,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not rules; they are guidelines. They don't have very good ones for digital. Understanding what those are, and then doing your best to follow the guidelines, and then to find folks that might be able to help you actually test some of these things, but also understand that parity of experience. If there's, what are the senses? Can we make an audio component, or is there a mobile version of this that someone who needs a screen reader can use? And which is what we did for the poster maker. We made a mobile version of this, completely separate application that you could do the experience on your phone, which means if you have settings for your phone that are like contrast settings or text legibility settings or audio settings, like a screen reader, that would all come into play. So people using their mobile phones is one of the key ways that one of the keys way that institutions are trying to create more on-ramps to the experience, right? If it's not as accessible in situ.
Yeah, that's a great thing that came up earlier today in class, that like, can you have like a companion app,
Mm-hmm.
So the question, I'm gonna like reword it, but it's basically like, what could have been done better during the project? But like, you've been doing so many of these now for years, so how do you collect what goes wrong and what goes well and pass that on to the next project? Do you have
Burned into your mind.
I feel like they're so wildly different. There are always learning curves for certain things, but
Mhm.
every single one we do, there's definitely things we learn along the way, particularly when it comes to accessibility. And I think the overarching thing that we're always learning, that we're constantly improving on, is removing as much UI as possible and taking the website feel out of things. I think that in particular that's less of a like thing that we screwed up that we wanted to fix, but more of like, we're continually getting better and better about taking out the things that aren't needed and just including the things that are, particularly when it comes to UI, to make the experience as effortless as possible for the user.
Yeah.
The more next buttons, et cetera, we can take out of the game and just have it more automatic moments, the more seamless it is for the visitor.
You just answered another one of my questions. Which was, how do you balance UX versus UI? Do you find yourself removing UI to better benefit the UX? Or are there situations when you choose UI over UX? That kind of, sounds like you are adjusting as you go. Do you often start with, there's a website with a lot of content, and then you're building a kiosk with that content?
Not necessarily. I think it's just, there's always that impulse to take cues from websites. And so sometimes you have to get your head out of that to best plan for a table, particularly if it's multi-touch, right? Because that's a whole different experience as well. You use different affordances for that. The other thing is that we do a lot of user testing, particularly towards the end of a project. So things that we might think are givens or assumed may not always be, and user testers can surprise us with what they don't get or what they do get. And so there's always this sort of flurry at the end where we rework certain parts of an experience because you don't know what you don't know.
Mm-hmm. Have you, I'm curious, what applications and languages are you using to build these things with?
We're using Vue a lot now.
Okay, cool.
And there's a whole bunch of other stuff, Electron and all these other, who knows, there's like a million libraries. We're using Vue a lot. We are using React previously. So these kinds of frameworks, obviously, we're also using, there's a, it's called, is it Qt?
Yep,
Qt.
Qt.
So, that's
C++, I think.
yeah, that's right. C++ based. We've used that. But funnily enough, we are using web technologies to build a lot of these kiosks
really
because
funny.
it translates, right? It also opens up the pool of, maybe developers who can work on them as well, right? Just because you've got a lot more people doing web kind of related applications development.
Cool.
And something specific.
Yeah, oftentimes we're using a lot of the same kind of web tools, like there's a library that we need to use, or there's a database that we have to link to where all these assets and images live. So there's a lot of the same kind of structures that it's like, why recreate it if there's a web-based tool that already does that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's talk about scope of these projects. So how long generally does it take, and how many people are involved? And so I'm assuming there's probably a group of people and you're dividing out tasks. Can you kind of talk about that process?
I mean, it runs the gamut in terms of how long these things take. I mean, it really depends on the complexity, and oftentimes it really depends on the content production lifecycle, right? How long is it going to take to gather and organize all of the images and the videos and the assets that are going to be in the piece? At our studio, I think virtually everyone at some point touches these, right? So they go through an initial concepting phase where designers, content strategists, we're all working together to kind of come up with some initial ideas for, how the piece might look, feel, work. We initially do some kinds of schematics or wireframes or content outlines, right, that help us get a sense of like, how does it flow? What kinds of content could fit in it, right? And then we really get into prototyping, where we're either making kind of like video or little like motion representations of what the sort of interactivity is to get a feel for it, while developers are getting started, like building the software infrastructure to kind of make the thing come to life. And as developers are sort of ramping up, various members of the team, producers, designers, content production, we're all kind of working and building momentum together on various streams. And we come together at different kind of milestone points to review or create requirements, right? What does this thing have to do? What have we learned are the absolute must-haves the piece should have? What are problems that are coming up? What is testing revealed? So it is this sort of long-term kind of interwoven strategy with I think pretty much all disciplines in the studio.
Mm-hmm.
I think most of our projects probably the project life cycle, right, is typically going to be like 6 months. We don't have many things that are shorter than that, to be honest.
Yeah.
Mostly because again, these are site specific, so that typically means they're in an exhibition. They're not too many one-offs, so those just always have longer timelines, and so you kind of calibrate the work that you're doing to that timeline as well.
I realize it's 3:51, so I think I'm gonna ask one more. Oh yeah. Okay, maybe two, because one's really short, but because I just got another one in. But I could stay all day and talk to you, but I'll do a couple quick questions, and then also just if you can tell us where there are things that are up in Portland now that people can visit. So the question is like, where does your list of users, like where do your personas come from? Does it come from your client? Do you append that list? Like how do you decide who your customers are?
I mean, some of that work comes out of other work that's done aside from the table creative itself. We have a user experience designer on staff that will do some of that work and workshop with the client and workshop with potential visitors or users of that experience or people that represent those sort of categories and audience segments. So there's a strategy arm here as well that will often kind of pave the road before we get to this portion, depending upon how big the project is. Sometimes it's pretty straightforward, right? So particularly if it's for a larger museum where it's open to the general public, you kind of have to account for everybody.
Yeah, and they probably have some data that they can offer as well, right?
Definitely, and that just gets into, affordances for language as well, which is a whole other consideration. We do work for the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and so for them, everything's in English and French because Canada. So those are other things that we have to take into account.
Mm-hmm. And Edlyn, because you're a graduate, and Katrina, are you also a graduate of
Yep.
PSU?
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, like I don't know, what the question that all students want to know is like, what can you do to prepare yourself and to also look most desirable to cool places like Upswell? Like how do you get a job? And what are you finding that you learned at PSU that has been most valuable? It's kind of a giant question, but
Edlyn, you want to go first? You're the fresher grad.
Sorry, could you
You can turn your audio on now.
Great. I definitely learned like a really strong fundamental principle of design from that program, even though it was mostly focusing on like branding and like packaging, not much about like a digital design. And it's something that I think I still like strong latch on, like, okay, the typography and also like the color theory that's also really useful on the digital design. I think a little one off the aspect that we kind of like often neglect that it's that usually I used to work with like really small like font size for like packaging, 9 points. That's my go-to. But now the minimum font size has to go above 16.
yeah.
Just FYI.
Realistically, 22.
Thing. Yeah, in my class, I'm like gotta get bigger
the
font.
size.
Cool.
Other than that, I actually got this job from making a connection from the student show at Ryan and Kennedy. I just made friends with the guest and we grab a coffee. Just don't afraid to like reach out and like make connection. And that's how you get, get to the job that you want.
Awesome. Yeah, coffee talk.
Yes.
Okay. What happens when the exhibits are over? Where do the things go? Where does all the stuff go?
Often away.
Just away.
This is the sad truth.
Yeah.
Sometimes we get tasked with actually conversely putting some of these into web formats so that they can be disseminated widely after an exhibition is over. So sometimes that does happen. And so there's some work to have to like translate certain things into web format. But I would say most often they're meant to be, they're designed for a set of time and they live and they go away. And I think honestly, some live for much longer than they need to sometimes given the technology, and that's because the technology and platforms and things have changed so quickly, and hardware ages out so quickly. It's another reason to try and go with very sort of simple designs, right, from a UX and UI standpoint, because this thing will live for a couple of years, and if you're lucky enough that it lives for longer, you want to make sure that it doesn't feel sort of too trendy or too of a time period, right? Because things in this space move so fast. So we do a lot of work for something that maybe doesn't live beyond the life of the exhibition or exhibit.
Or I've worked on projects that live for 12 to 14 years. So yeah, in that case, you better make sure that you're not using something too trendy that is going to feel really tired down the line. The other sort of alternative is sometimes these things travel. This particular, this poster maker that we've got up here was made for an inaugural exhibition in Canada, but then it has been slated to travel the country in the US. So I think it was in Texas. I'm not sure where it is now, but it can move around for a bit.
So it better be made well in those cases.
Well, and it just also, comes up with, well, do you really need to have a dual language, English and French for Texas?
Cool. So I'm going to let you go, but before, just give us a list of places and kiosks that are still working in the Portland area.
I think the main one we have is probably the Oregon Historical Society. I think winter sports is gone, right? But the permanent exhibit Experience Oregon has several of our kiosks in it. There's a map interactive where you can explore historical maps. There's what we call feedback stations, which are getting like visitor kind of perspectives and opinions on Oregon stories. And then there's the sort of memory blanket interactive that Erica mentioned. So those would be places where there are interactive kiosks. We also have a temporary exhibit right now at the World Forestry Center up in Washington Park.
Okay.
There are not really digital components to that because it's a really temporary, like pop-up kind of exhibit space, but there are analog interactives in that, which might be interesting to sort of take a look at and just see how maybe small scale exhibits come together. I don't know if there are any others in Portland.
Any in Vancouver, Washington, close by? No.
Most of our clients are on the East Coast right now, so that tends to be where they're all at.
Cool.
You could also look at the Oregon Historical Society has there's a bunch of web tools, right? I mean, there's like web-based things we could also provide links to.
Cool.
Okay. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time and coming to say hello. And if it's okay, I'd like to share this with PSU GD so they can kind of see our talk. Yep. Oh, I'm echoing. All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so
Nice
much.
to meet you all.
Appreciate it.
Bye. And
Bye.
our class, stick around.
Right. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Sweet.
Cool.
That was awesome.